Who Speaks for the Trees? Exploring Environmental Solutions, Past, Present, and Future, with our guest speakers, Christopher Caldwell and Professor Norman Wurzba. On behalf of the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship, BPALC, I am Peter Mark Janssen, your host for this evening. I'm an Associate Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering, Faculty Director at the Center for Sustainability and Environment, as well as a faculty affiliate of BPALC. We are very grateful for the financial support of the Open Discourse Coalition, made up of many supportive Bucknell alums. In addition to thanking you, our virtual audience, for joining us, I want to especially thank our two guests. Christopher Caldwell, a contributing editor at the Claremont Review of Books and a contributing opinion writer for the New York Times. He's the author of Reflections on the Revolution in Europe, Immigration, Islam in the West, and the Age of Entitlement, America Since the 60s. And Professor Norman Wurzba, the Gilbert T. Rowe Distinguished Professor of Theology at Duke University. His teaching and research is located at the intersections of theology, philosophy, and environmental and agrarian studies. He is the author of several books, including Food and Faith, A Theology of Eating, and The Paradise of God, Reviving Religion in an Ecological Age. His latest book, The Sacred Life, Humanity in a Wounded World, will be published this fall. Welcome to everyone. And I hope you enjoyed the brightness of the sun this cold spring day in central Pennsylvania, or from wherever you are joining us from. So without further ado, I would like to encourage each of you to share questions you might have for our speakers in the Q&A as they occur to you. The format for tonight is to have our speakers share some of their thoughts on our discussion theme, our query for the evening of whether or not environmentalism is too ideological or not cultural enough, and if a broader coalition for living humbly on the earth could possibly bridge current divisions in America. I will then ask them to answer a few of my queries on US environmentalism, past, present, and future. And then we will hopefully dialogue on some of your audience questions, as many as we can have time for. This is the last program in the series Toward a More Perfect Union, about overcoming divisions in American society. And to watch videos of this and previous episodes, please visit bucknellleaders.org. I would like to now ask Professor Wurzba if he would kick us off and tell us what he would like to share for the evening. Thank you.
All right. So thank you so much, Peter. It's a pleasure to be with you this evening. In my presentation this evening, I want first to say some things about why scholars in the natural and social sciences, but also in the humanities and fine arts, now refer to our time as the Anthropocene epoch. What is it, and what does it mean? But then I also want to suggest a way forward as a kind of response to the naming of this epoch. More specifically, I want to consider why it matters that we find ways to speak about this world and its life as sacred, since it is my conviction that apart from a recovery of the sanctity of creatures, it will be difficult to appreciate why trees are worth speaking about and protecting at all. So first, the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene marks the unprecedented moment when humanity, or at least a subset of humans, became a dominant force in planetary history, responsible for the widespread alteration of the world's land, ocean, and atmospheric systems. In previous epochs, nature was presumed to dwarf and limit human power. But in the Anthropocene, the situation is nearly the reverse. Human power and ambition are now the limiting and enabling factors shaping the Earth's future. With the advent of the Anthropocene, the meaning of humanity, of world, and of humanity's being in the world undergo a profound transformation. This transformation bears with great force on questions that are at once scholarly, but also intensely practical. We must ask anew, what is a human being? What are human responsibilities? now that we have become the species that actively creates the world. We must ask, too, into the character and significance of the world given humanity's tremendous power over it and our ability to engineer the bases of life. Is this world reducible to a stockpile of natural resources to be commodified, mined, and sold? The work ahead, I would argue, calls for a fundamental rethinking and reimagining of humanity's place in this new world. How should we characterize people? As miners, managers, stewards? Or would designations like students or servants perhaps be more appropriate? The Anthropocene is part of a threefold crisis of ecology, economics, and politics. First, it marks the moment when the subject matter of ecology, which we might describe as nature and the relations among living things and their environments, this subject matter of ecology comes to be actively produced and transformed by human actions, thereby calling into question the very idea of a natural state of affairs. The degradation of ecosystems and human communities reflects a crisis that calls us both to save nature and ourselves, while at the same time casting doubt on the meaning of that call. The world we are called to save will also now be a world we have made. This raises the important question: does nature any longer have normative status if its places and processes are always already shaped by human endeavor? One effect of the Anthropocene discourses is to have shown us that the very idea of nature is no longer obvious. Is it pristine wilderness? If so, has nature disappeared with the advent of climate change or species extinctions, or the growth of a global human population that is now roughly at 8 billion people? Moreover, how should we design cities in a time of rapid urbanization if nature can no longer serve as a guide? Secondly, the Anthropocene arises in important part from the failure of a modern economic order to arrive at a self stabilizing equilibrium. Take the example of climate change, only one of many drivers of the Anthropocene, but nonetheless emblematic. Greenhouse gas emissions are what economists call externalities, consequences for which no one is held responsible because they fall outside the scheme of price based transactions that structure economic order. But this outside is now the global environment in which we must all live, an externality that threatens to undermine the rest of economic and social order. The Anthropocene compels us to acknowledge that economies are always embedded within ecosystems and dependent upon ecosystem processes. Economic health must therefore be tied to and informed by ecosystem health, all the while acknowledging the difficulty of ascertaining the precise nature of what that health is. But this has proved inordinately difficult for economists to do. Efforts to calculate something called ecosystem services or to do anything like full cost accounting have fallen flat if they have been entertained at all. In a time of rapid glacial melt, what is the price of fresh water to Indian and Chinese populations that can no longer count on streams or rivers flowing from the Himalayan mountains? Or in a time of extreme heat, how should water managers assess the value of the fresh water that is fast being pumped out of the Ogallala Aquifer in America's High Plains region of the Southwest? One of the signal failures of today's global consumer economy is that it is anonymous and renders consumers blind by placing them behind a veil of ignorance in which the histories of products are hidden from view. People, for the most part, do not know where products come from or how they were produced. As a result, it is much more difficult for them to make the choices that might make for healthier habitats and more just communities. Third, political responses have so far been signally inadequate to address Anthropocene challenges. It turns out that the self interested decisions of individual voters, stockholders, nations, even human generations predictably generate a catastrophic passing off of responsibility. In the narrow terms of self interested rationality, it is always convenient to hand off the problem to someone else, except that ultimately there is no one else. Political leaders are driven by the short term of election cycles, while corporate leaders are beholden to the even shorter quarterly business report. We lack, it seems, both institutions and forms of citizenship and political mobilization that can be equal to this task. For instance, how would we design energy systems or agricultural practices that will ensure clean power and nutritious food, not for a few years, but for a few thousand years? If the Anthropocene challenges the neat separation between nature and culture, it also calls for an expansion of political representation and process to include the other than human world. What would it take for the interests of our grandchildren to have a place at the tables of deliberation and power? Should trees and forests, rivers and watersheds, peregrine falcons and bison have a voice in policy decision making? If so, how? In the Anthropocene, ecology is embedded within economic life and vice versa. The ways that people draw energy and sustenance from the earth and other species have drawn us into a new collective and an implicit landscape architecture that now forms our obsessively human shaped and human oriented world. Our economy, in turn, is embedded within law and politics. From energy to agriculture to infrastructure, our patterns of habitation take their shape from institutions and collective decisions about how we will decide to live together. But do we have the legal mechanisms and the political processes to address ecological and meteorological problems that are global in scope and do not fall neatly within national borders? This means that what we ordinarily call environmental problems cannot stand apart from larger questions of political economy. By the same token, questions such as inequality of income and wealth have environmental dimensions. As recent groundbreaking work by economists and public health scholars shows, we live in geographically distributed ecologies of empowerment and vulnerability, whose elements range from natural systems and pollution to infrastructure and institutions. As we are already seeing, the viability of nation states and regional economies is being decisively shaped by environmental factors like drought, rising sea levels, and disease vectors, just as natural habitats are facing new pressures owing to increased resource demand, human migration, and more intensively managed agricultural regimes. As is also becoming clear, the effects of climate change are not evenly or justly distributed. Poor people and communities of color are already suffering and will continue to suffer disproportionately as wealthy elites consume and construct ever more to shield themselves from climate refugees, food and water shortages, energy blackouts, extreme weather, and rising oceans. The Anthropocene, as these brief remarks indicate, tell us that the future of our world is a question of political economy, in which both economics and politics are necessarily rooted and responsive to increasingly degraded ecosystems. But the questions of political economy invariably have a moral and spiritual significance that outruns any merely quantitative and technocratic frame. To think about the world at this time, then, is also to ask hard-edged questions about the value and purpose of productive technology, the worth of labor relations, and most generally, the meaning and point of human and fellow creaturely life. Why is life valuable, and how will we construct and inhabit our towns and cities in ways that honor that value? How will we humble ourselves enough to protect the microbial life that is crucial to the health of soil systems? How will we resist the extractivist, exploitative logic that degrades natural and human communities alike? It is worth noting that the Anthropocene has sometimes also been called the Capitalocene. This is a highly contested debate about this naming, but one aspect that I want to consider here is that this term, the Capitalocene, ugly as it is, reflects an unprecedented and relatively recent commodification of land, water, and creatures, humans included. This epoch can be said to begin with the mercantile capitalism of the 15th to 16th centuries, or what the historian Sven Beckert says is more accurately described as military capitalism, since it was a system that depended on the violent appropriation of land and the idea that the point and value of places as that they can be put to work to enrich stockholders. Moreover, It was a system that depended on slavery and the violent subjugation of countless workers. It would be difficult to overestimate how systems like the plantation, mines, industrial factories radically transform the way people think about this earth, fellow creatures, and the purpose of a human life. Is this system still at work today? The temptation is to say no, but I would suggest that we are still living in it. And one form of proof would be the ease with which we speak of places and creatures as units of production or units in an investment portfolio, and of people as units of consumption. The clearest way to understand this is to think about today's agriculture. Land is not valued or engaged as a source of a community's livelihood. Instead, it is valued as a business investment, which is to say, it is priced so highly that no farmer could ever crawl out of the debt undertaken to buy it by farming it responsibly. Animal livestock, whether chickens, pigs, sheep, or cattle, are not creatures bearing a sanctity that calls forth our respect and care, but are genetically engineered and efficiently managed to produce as much meat as quickly and cheaply as possible. Agricultural workers, meanwhile, are no longer technically slaves, but they are often migrant workers who live in constant fear of deportation and abuse and are hardly paid a just wage or given adequate worker protections and benefits. This is a system that produces mountains of calories, to be sure, but it is also a system that is making many of its eaters sick and unhealthy with conditions like early onset diabetes and obesity. One has to look fairly hard to find signs of the honoring of life in today's dominant food and agricultural systems. So, is there an alternative to the commodification of the world? Is there a better way to name and narrate this world and its life? I think there is. And the way to do that is to characterize this world as a place populated with sacred gifts. This is not a new idea, it's ancient and is shared by indigenous and religious traditions alike. The basic insight and impulse animating this way of speaking is that human beings do not invent or control this world and its life. To live, they must rely on incomprehensible powers and learn to receive from these powers the gifts of food, water, photosynthesis, pollination, digestion. Hunters, foragers, farmers, and gardeners know this simply by doing their work. In societies that acknowledge this world as a gift, it is of the greatest importance that people learn to express gratitude for this life. And one of the best ways to do that is to take up a moral relationship with fellow creatures rather than simply a financial one. The daily exercise of eating makes this clear. Ask yourself, how do you make yourself worthy of the life and death you regularly consume? Within a sacred conception, the answer is that you learn to nurture the life, nurture the world that nurtures you. A spiritually and morally successful life is not one that simply takes and consumes, it is one that gives back, takes care, shows respect, and honors the creative power that gives us a beautiful and delicious world. The philosopher Michel de Montaigne once said, "He who has his mind on taking no longer has it on what is taken." This is a profound truth that tells us that it is possible for people to live in a world and never actually know where they are and who or what they are with. Because in the rush to commodify and appropriate, and we should say that in the Anthropocene epoch, the rush has accelerated as people intensify their efforts to get for themselves as much of the world as is left. In this rush to commodify and appropriate, we do not take the time or focus the attention necessary to recognize that our places and fellow creatures are precious and worthy of cherishing. I end my remarks by turning to a fairly well-known story that is found at the beginning of the Jewish and Christian scriptures, the 7-day creation of the world. As you may recall, in this narrative, God creates by separating light from darkness, day from night, ground from sky, water from dry land. God also populates the water, skies, and land with fish, birds, animals, and human beings, remembering that we are created the same day with the land animals. One of the reasons people love this story is because on day 6, God creates humans, says they are made in the image of God, and then tells them to have dominion over everything that moves. The takeaway for many people has been that this world exists for us. And this idea is confirmed when we say, or are told rather, that we are to rule and have dominion over everything else because, presumably, we are the kings and queens of the heap. There's a lot going on in this story, but what I want to emphasize tonight is how much this story has been misunderstood and badly applied. The main problem? It forgets all about day 7. And this is the crucial oversight because it is on day 7 that people learn what creation is ultimately for, what its point is, and what the goal of a human life should be. So, what happens on day 7? God rests. God practices the first Shabbat. So we should ask, why does God do this? Clearly, it can't be because God is exhausted or because God is bored and distracted. God rests instead by coming into the presence of a freshly created and beautiful world and taking delight in it. We know this because as God is creating the world, God regularly pronounces upon it the divine affirmation of its goodness. It is important to say that genuine rest requires people to put an end to the restlessness that so dominates our culture and economy today. People feel they need to have more, do more, be more, even though most of us currently enjoy a standard of life that would have been unimaginable to most people even 100 years ago. But our restlessness and our exhausting quest to have more is destroying our planet, our communities, and our personal lives, which is why I highlight the 7th day, because in this story, it tells us that the point of a human life is to learn to appreciate and delight in each creature as a sacred gift. We need this Sabbath insight in our Anthropocene world because what we need is not more commodification, control, and appropriation of the world. What we most need are economies that help us cherish this world and its diverse life as a sacred gift. What we need are rituals and educational processes that help us discover that we are surrounded by creatures that are fundamentally given and to be humbly respected, gratefully received, and carefully nurtured. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Professor Worspa. Christopher Caldwell, would you please share with us your thoughts this evening?
Yes, I'm glad to. I'd like to thank you, Professor Janssen, and I'd like to thank Professor Wiertzba for his great talk. I'd like to thank everyone at the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship for having this, and thank all of you for being here. It's there's no one with whom I'd rather spend Earth Day. I would like to talk a little bit about where we've come in the last 51 years, because I think there's been a real transformation of our society, including on environmental matters, and that you can see through the transformation of Earth Day. I mean, today, generally, Earth Day, I would say, is focused on global warming. It involves science, teaching, and politics. I would say that 51 years ago, at the first Earth Day, it was a very different thing culturally. I would say it was focused on pollution of various kinds. I would say it involved community preaching and cleaning up actions. There's been a paradigm shift that I have described before and would like to describe this evening as one between ecology, as it used to be called, and environmentalism. They're on a continuum, but I think that each of them is a kind of a historically determined thing. If I had to try to identify a sort of a fulcrum point for when ecology turned into environmentalism, I would say it would probably be in, around the late 1980s, around 1989. That was the time when scientists, in places like the Mauna Loa Observatory and in Antarctica began to actively not just collect but analyze international data on the climate. It's when the United Nations set up the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. It's when American politics shifted with the first generation of what you might call green politicians, such as Al Gore for one, and Tim Wirth for another, who was the first American politician to speak of what he called a New Deal for global warming. I'd like to remind you that there were other paradigm shifts just as intense in other walks of life going on right then. Maybe it would help us to review them a little bit. First of all, obviously, the Cold War ended, and this meant ideological change. Of course, communism in its Soviet form was discredited. Even socialism in Western Europe and the United States was put on its back foot. But less obviously, the ideological change applied to things that were not quite high politics. That same period saw an end to modernism and the arts. So, for instance, people who are sitting where you're sitting, undergraduates, basically between the 1920s and the 1980s, were taught about Picasso and T.S. Eliot as being the center of the Western intellectual tradition, in a way that I don't believe they are now. For another thing, you had psychoanalysis, which was probably the dominant secular religion of the West in the 20th century, was still alive. It died for the most part in 1989. If you look at social movements, you see that they pretty much mirror this transformation that went on in our regard to the environment. So obviously in civil rights, you had the invention of the term people of color, which was a shift in the focus of civil rights. And in fact, it was in 1990 and 1991 that the term political correctness first gained currency in the United States. It was the subject of a number of magazine cover stories, and it's when most people learned what it was. Probably the closest analog to the environmental tradition, though, was in the transformation of women's lib, as it was then called, into feminism. And it was it's a movement that resembled the ecology to environmentalism move in the same way. Now, I mention these things only to show that environmentalism is not merely a response to data. It's not merely a response to a crisis in the world. It is also embedded in a larger civilizational shift. And because it is, all of these things that we talk about in environmentalism are going to be hotly contested. That is one of the reasons why I find some of the things that Professor Wurtzba said in his talk a few minutes ago highly sympathetic and very innovative. But maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that later on tonight. When I talk about this civilizational shift, I think we can highlight three aspects. The first is practical, the second philosophical, the third political. Practical. Let's talk about the practical shifts that have been happening over the last 51 years and that you could really see changing rapidly in the late 1980s. As I said, at the first Earth Day, the practical problems that presented themselves were those of pollution, streams, air, wildlife. There was also an aesthetic of the time, which was a sort of I would say a pure preference for natural over artificial things. That is, I think, one of the major differences between the environmentalism of the 1970s, which in almost any circumstance would consider a cotton flannel shirt superior to a Patagonia fleece. It's one of the major cultural differences between 1970s environmentalism and today. The pragmatic, the difference in the problems also led to a difference in solutions. The solutions back then were not as scientific as they are today. They were matters of abatement. And that's why, abatement just meaning lessening the number of chemicals in a river, shrinking the number of smog particles in the air, bringing back, bald eagles to the cliffs of Maine. That was what the focus was. And it's why by the 1980s, I think a lot of people considered this type of ecology a great success. I want to say something parenthetically about abatement before I move on to other things, and maybe we could discuss it later. Abatement, the lessening of pollution in American life, which is probably the most extraordinary physical change in American life over the last 50 years, is only partially due to government action and regulation. There is a second part of it, which is the flight of heavy industry to other parts of the world. And that makes this all, the shifting of the context from national to international makes all of this very hard to discuss, because it really is not clear whether we have eliminated pollution or whether we have just moved it to a different place where we are lucky enough not to have to deal with it ourselves. The second level on which you can see this, this civilizational shift is philosophical. I have said that in the 1970s, Earth Day was a lot about preaching, and now it's a lot about teaching. Earth Day in the 70s was a movement of, I would say, religious and spiritual people. If you wanted to look at an archetypal document of early 70s ecology, it might be Fritz Schumacher's book, Small is Beautiful, which is about common sense ways that you can face the world and in a non-wasteful, non-polluting way. It's about understanding what a sink is. It's about understanding what the tolerance margins of our rivers and air were. I would say that maybe the archetypal document of today would be a book like David Wallace Wells's Uninhabitable Earth, which uses statistics and science to show us exactly the kind of position we're in. And so I would say today that we have, I would say that as ecology has moved to environmentalism, I would say that it's not only no longer dominated by the religious or spiritual impulse, it's become somewhat hostile to spiritual impulses. And in fact, any way of discussing this problem that does not give 100% faith and obedience to scientific data and to the appointed scientific experts is referred to as denialism. And I think that there's a really unnecessary polarization that has grown up around that we would do well to get over. The second thing that happened philosophically is specialization. Ecology in the 1970s, this Schumacherian idea of cleaning up the rivers, it was something that ordinary citizens could understand by looking at it. The archetype of the 1970s ecological problem was polluted waterways in industrial centers. It was the Charles River in Boston, where you had to have a tetanus shot if you fell in. It was the Lake Erie in front of Cleveland, which caught fire at one point in the early 1970s. Or it was polluted highways, the LA smog, which is the cause of a lot of California's air pollution abatement strategy. That type of problem is totally compatible with democracy as Americans understand it. It's a problem that presents itself as options. Here's a factory, here is a river. You can either have an open running factory with all the jobs in a polluted river, or you can close the factory and you can have a clean river. But that's something that the people can be trusted to set priorities on. The environmentalism today is based on a very specialized and I would say esoteric kind of climate science. It's based on questions not like, do we close that factory, but like, what is the rate beyond which we should worry about getting to 450 parts per million of CO2 at the Mauna Loa Observatory? That's not really the kind of question that most people feel competent to address. And I'm afraid that a lot of environmentalism today does very little to make this possible for people to address. I will end by talking about a few shifts, few ways this has shifted politically, and then I'll stop and maybe we'll discuss some more of them later. At the same time, over the last 50 years, we have seen an increasing internationalization of this, this problem. Back when when the problem was pollution and the solution was in abatement, very few of these problems were international or crossed borders. I mean, there are some countries that have watersheds that flow into other countries, but generally the problem that we looked at for those was more military, more using them to seize a geostrategic advantage than, worsening the environment for other people. As the result of this internationalization, but also as a result of increasing specialization, the environment turned into a matter of class. And this is one of the things that bedevils it today. Environmentalism, being conscious of the earth, tends to be defended by, let's say, elites who have the knowledge or the credentials to understand the science, and by those who trust the system enough to back those elites. And that means by people who have done pretty well out of the last decades. It tends to be opposed by people who have received promises based on expertise, based on an expertise that might be analogous to the kind of expertise we rely on to solve climate problems. And so this is what's creating a landscape that turns this into a very confusing problem, because the democratic publics are not science faculties. And when the public debates scientific questions, it's often not science that's being debated, but attitudes towards authority. And let me leave it just there for now.
Thank you so very, very much for those remarks. And I appreciate the background that you just gave us too in the last 51 years of Earth Day. And I was wondering if Professor Wurzba had any things that he wanted to respond to, because I was going to take you back in my question, because again, what I'm trying to look for here is some common ground that we could create a good platform for our young people and college students who are going to go out into this brave new world, and what they can do environmentally, ecologically, with their votes, with their with their lives, with their decisions of how to live humbly as consumers. Or and again, I think about some great things that were influential to me historically, thinking about where we are here in Bucknell, in the location that was inhabited by the Susquehannock people, that were one of the great groups of the Iroquois Confederation, who came up with that seventh generation principle, which the idea that, okay, we're going to live humbly, we're also going to think about the future generations, and we're going to deal with the local, as Christopher pointed out, because we know if we foul our own backyard and foul our region backyard, our tribes, will not be successful. And then I'm also Again, when you remember John Muir and him setting aside some of the earliest national forests and national preservation of those forests, he saw the behavior of humanity going from the East Coast all the way to the West, basically cutting down every tree for, consumption for the lumber industry, and finally got Teddy Roosevelt in 1903 to spend 3 nights in the woods with him to then launch the greatest national parks kind of preservation and creation, so that the average person could see the beauty of nature and therefore appreciate it enough to want to protect it. And with Rachel Carson showing us the Silent Spring book, which was like her 5th book, I think, at the time, showing that we were having this fouling our own local ecosystems and rivers, and we had to turn that around. And so I'm thinking, like, do you guys, as you look back on the past, do you see milestones in the past that show that we do have the ability to come together? You suggested one, Christopher. We're saying the ecological movement. Now we've quote unquote cleaned things up, but maybe that's because we exported our pollution. And again, that's a major moral issue. So I would like if you would maybe reflect on that question of, what can we actually learn from the past that could have a direct bearing on, us coming together, as opposed to us being divided for whatever reasons. And maybe, Christopher, you could just spend a minute or two thinking about that, because you've already talked about the past, and then Professor Wertz, but you could jump in with not only answer to that, but also any other things that you wanted to share response to that Christopher might have shared at this point.
Well, I would have a hard time doing better than the 2 examples you gave, which is the conversion of Teddy Roosevelt to the idea of preserving our great natural sites, and Rachel Carson's Rachel Carson's entire work before she wrote Silent Spring it's an extraordinary body of work, but her campaign against the use of DDT in American farming is definitely a watershed. I would just say, in general, though, I think that what's important in the United States is not a moment, but a process. The United States is a real Western country in the Western tradition, but it's got certain peculiarities. It was founded on a new continent. Of course, the continent was inhabited, but it was a wild continent, and it was founded by striving men, by people who wanted to, who needed to hack a living out of the wilderness. So unlike in Europe, where you have, for all their problems, hierarchical systems, these European cultures also understood that they were in a reciprocal relationship with the land. They had no place to move on to, and you had to keep the land performing year after year, so you had to treat it with a certain gentleness. That was not our history. The environment was a threat. It was an enemy. It was also something that we thought we could move on from. If you burned up your, if you eroded the soil in your coastal area, you could go to the Midwest. And so the United States has had to go through a process where it's where Americans have had to learn that the land is not just something to be exploited, but is also something to enter into a relationship with.
Thank you for that, Professor Wurzbach.
Yeah, I want to pick up on that last point that Christopher makes. I think it's hugely important. The frontier is closed. There is no more virgin territory, as it has been called in the past. And so this is, I think, a time in which something like America's maturity needs to come to the fore. And what Christopher was saying earlier about some of the key indicators of early environmentalism, especially in the 60s and 70s, I think is very helpful and illuminating. And I think it bears noting that, we look at Rachel Carson's book today and just see how magnificent and powerful it was as a text to get us thinking about how the poisoning of our earth is eventually going to harm us. But it's also worth noting how that book was fought vigorously by establishment in business and science. right? That they did not want to hear this message, did not want to receive this message. And I think another book that bears noting in this regard is Wendell Berry's The Unsettling of America, published in 77, which is a book that was really taking Rachel Carson's work about DDT and more broadly describing the state of industrial agriculture and what it was doing to our lands in the forms of soil erosion, water degradation, but also in the ways that it was directly affecting the ways farmers were treating animals, the way farm workers were being treated by an economy that was just scrupulous about the bottom line and making food as cheap as possible. And I think this is going to be the next stage in America's maturation, whether or not we're going to be adult enough to recognize that we can't have land that is endlessly available, and we can't have what the land provides at always the cheapest price. Because what we know is that consumer demand for cheap food is creating an agriculture that is really abusive to land, plants, animals, farmers, and in the end, also our eaters.
Thank you so much. I'd like each of you to, we talked a little bit about the past. I'd like to focus now on the present. And I would like each of you to elaborate on where you think we are as a nation today. In terms of ideology, in terms of culture, as it relates to our shared earth and our obligations as the sentient beings to the rest of the creatures, locally and all around the world, and how different proposals and topics that come up potentially that are divisive. Like if we discuss some of the aspects of the Green Deal, which has elements like banning internal combustion engines as a way to make the as Christopher said earlier, to keep certain parts per million at a certain level, that this is actually part of the Green New Deal. And what do you especially think our undergraduate students need to know to actively and effectively engage with our present ecological and environmental issues? And Professor Wurzba first, and then go to Christopher.
Yeah, it's difficult. There's just so many ideological streams that are flowing right now, so it's hard to identify any one or two in particular. But I'll highlight some that I think are quite important, and this is also a way of marking how I think our environmental or ecological consciousness has shifted. In that, the focus early on was clearly about wilderness preservation, right? That was the main objective, and the parks, of course, and National Wildlife Refuge and things of that sort were key markers of the desire to protect. And the sort of the prototypical environmentalist was, as Christopher said, somebody who has got significant resources. Now they drive a Prius, they're mostly white, and they go to the Sierra Club meetings. I think what's changed is that now we're seeing that environmentalism is no longer strictly about or solely about wilderness preservation, right? We're bringing farmland, we're bringing urban areas into the discussion. It's becoming less of a white phenomenon because the question of environmental justice is now becoming one that is of great significance, because it doesn't do us any good to preserve wilderness if our farmlands and our watersheds around our cities are faring very, very badly. So I think that's a signature difference that we might highlight about where we are today. And that means that the face of environmentalism is changing. It's a lot younger than it used to be. And there's a lot more, I think, women who are involved in the struggles, because the questions of public health more generally have been merging with the question of ecological health. And this is making environmentalism a much more difficult thing to navigate because we're not just talking about endangered species. We're talking about neighborhoods that are suffering. We're talking about Superfund sites in the heart of suburbia. We're talking about all different kinds of realities that now fall under an environmental mantle, I would say.
Thank you for that. Mr. Caldwell.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think we have a lot of these things are bound to be wrapped up very much in questions of power, and I actually, it's not. I'm really not interested in telling anyone how to vote or what attitude they should take. A lot of these things are really complicated, and they involve questions of of what is natural, and which go to the heart of people's family and religious traditions. And so let me just say one thing, that we are a democracy. I think we ought to be a democracy, and we can choose to do anything we like. You know, under a sort of purist libertarian idea of the Constitution, you know, that holds that you don't want to regulate anything. I think that we have to say that that idea has been defeated, because there has never been an administration in the last 100 years that has really been able to roll back this idea that we need to regulate certain things. So we can regulate things. We must do it democratically. It's always going to be tempting to do this undemocratically, to have a health board sort of declare something a health crisis and then do it by fiat. But within that democracy, we are dealing with values, and when you know, with questions of what is natural. So you have things like, should farmers be allowed to grow genetically modified foods? You know, they aren't in certain European countries. Should people be allowed to build new housing units with air conditioning in them in Arizona? Should cloning be permitted? These questions that sort of touch on what we are discussing are going to be hotly debated, and you just have to keep the debate open.
Thank you. What gives you, each of you, what gives you the greatest hope that we can come together to care for the environment and species beyond ourselves, especially in the challenges that we face as humanity right now? And how do you see us getting to this brighter shared future from here? And what would you like our students to know in order to, you know, play their part in making this a reality? And I'll go with Mr. Caldwell, Christopher first, please.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. I was recently reading a book by a French philosopher who used to be very well known in the 1960s when he was a radical Marxist. His name is Regis Debray, and he's 80 years old now, and he just wrote a book called The Green Century. And his view, we're going from the red century to the green century. And one of the things he said was that man's problem is that he is a tenant on the planet who mistook himself for its proprietor. And I think that is at the heart of the issue. And it's why I said that I was quite inspired by some of the things that Norman said early on. These issues are so contentious. They go so deeply to our values, and they threaten people's livelihoods so much that it's always going to be a very hot political issue. The hope for it lies in understanding that we are not the creators of the world, that we are its tenants, not its proprietors or its creators. And to act on that basis. And that's what would give me hope, if there were enough people thinking in that way.
Thank you, Christopher. And Norman, what are
Yeah,
your
so I mean, this might be a bit of a strange way to open this point, but I think what is very encouraging to me is to see the students that, you know, I encounter and engage, who are prepared in a way that I think is quite unique to ask very fundamental questions again. I think they look at my generation and they say, you know, we don't like what you all have done, and we don't want what you want. And they're wanting to ask different questions about what makes a life worth living. And so many of the young people I know are very interested in preserving, vitalizing communities. They're very interested in agriculture. They want to farm, but of course they can't afford to buy land. That's a problem. But they're realizing that the values that they've inherited have put us on a course that's not very good for their own future. And so they want to ask new questions. They want to do better things. And I take quite heart. I'm heartened by that, I would say. And what I would recommend to students is not just read books, not just read what other people are saying about the world, but try to make what you believe and think about the world come out of your experience being in the world. And so, for instance, when I encounter young people who want to farm and they want to talk about our food system, I tell them, first of all, you have to know the food system by being in it, to actually see what's happening, so that what you say isn't just the towing of a party line. Because there's a lot of sort of ideological discourses out there that want you to simply say the same things over and over again. And this is part of the specialization stuff that Christopher was talking about, where we have yielded our own direct encounter with the world, given that up to take somebody else's version of the world. And I want to encourage younger people to really, get into the world, see what's happening in our systems. How are they working? Where are they working well? Where are they working badly? And then by being involved, become part of the effort to improve it.
Yeah, thank you both for those great answers. And I have a lot of hope as well. One of the first audience questions that we actually has for both of you is if you were in charge of Earth Day programming across the entire country, what sort of topics would you want to focus on today?
I would like to pick up on something Norman said in his last answer. Is I'd say get out into the world. I don't think it should really be a day for proselytizing. I think that things should be a day about learning about the earth and where it is. So I would say a good about the best thing you could do on Earth Day, I think, would be to take a hike.
And you, what would you say, Professor Wedgwood?
Well, I think taking a hike is a good idea, but I also think that what would be really good is to shine a spotlight on some aspect of our world's functioning that is not clearly understood or doesn't come to light very much. I mentioned in my remarks how we live so much in an anonymous economy. We don't know where things come from or how they're made. And so I would say a good effort in Earth Day would be to pull some of the veil of ignorance aside, so that we could see, for instance, where does meat come from, or how do we get tomatoes, and do a kind of in-depth look into something like the life of a loaf of bread. That will give people a great deal of insight about not just the kind of world we're in, but also the kind of world we are creating every day.
Thank you. Thank you for that. This next question is quite interesting. I'm sure it'll maybe create a little bit of divisiveness, but you're each being asked to give us your thoughts on the Green New Deal recently proposed again by Representative Ocasio-Cortez and others. So give us your 2-minute version of what's good, what's bad, what's ugly, what's great, whatever your views are. I'm not trying to solicit anything other than where you guys are on this.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll start on this one. I think there are elements of the Green New Deal which I think are quite good insofar as they are bringing together issues that have often been kept apart. So that an energy bill and a farm bill is also a jobs bill. And often people don't do a good job connecting the dots on these things. And so, there are plenty of caricatures about the Green New Deal for sure. And I would want to say, let's be careful, not be too hasty about our judgments, but let's try to look at some of these things very carefully, so that if we're seeing that there is something like a recommendation to reduce coal burning as a way of producing energy, let's at the same time then pay attention to what we do in those communities that were formerly coal producing economies, and say, how do we bring jobs into these communities? How do we do it in a way that engages their democratic input, so that it doesn't become a paternalistic effort, for instance? I think what is a bit bothersome to me about the Green New Deal is that it has a paternalistic tone. And I would want to argue that whatever way we talk about a viable or just economy going forward, we're going to need the participation of the actors who will be the direct either beneficiaries or agents or the contributors to whatever economy is going to be proposed, because nobody wants an economy forced down their throat. And we need to appreciate that right now we're living in an economy that in many ways does force things down our throat, even if we might call it something like a free market economy.
In my view, the Green New Deal is almost surrealistically expensive. And I think the reason it's so expensive is that it assumes a kind of omniscience about what kind of things we're going to need once we've moved past the internal combustion economy. And I think a better approach is probably going to be a little more piecemeal. I also think that it really follows. It's deeply in the rut of the partisan divide as it exists in the year 2021. And I think that to get anything so enormous, as I say, the cost of it is just surrealistically large. It runs into the many tens of trillions, in order to do that, you need a much larger national mandate than you have. I'm sure some of the ideas in it have a good inspiration, but I think we're a long way from taking that route.
Thank you. This is a question for Norman with regard to Wendell Berry's book, The Unsettling of America. Today in America, now in the 21st century, is the emphasis on settler versus native culture in America helpful or not? And should we become more settled as well as more native in the sense of our ecological culture? And could you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the argument of unsettling of America still holds. And I think what's a bit depressing is to see that now, nearly 40 years later, well, more, 45 years later almost, we're in almost the same predicament, where we're still dealing with rates of erosion in our soils, water contamination, depletion. We're not doing much better in our treatment of animals, and we're certainly not doing better in our treatment of farmers and agricultural workers. So the argument is still very much intact. It's been made more difficult, more vicious, I would say, in the sense that now land is become the center of speculators, financiers who live in New York or London or Chicago, who use food markets as, commodities markets as a way to hedge against poverty and starvation. So it's become so much the site of investment that the land is no longer registering even as land. So I think absolutely we need to be talking about what it means to be settled in the land, committed to the land and the communities of it. And that means becoming indigenous. Right now, when you talk to food and agricultural experts, they will tell you with a population that is projected to maybe hit 10 or 11 billion people, we really have no idea how we're going to feed the world, because we're asked to intensify the green revolution, where yields are going down, water is being wasted, and soil fertility is going down. So we need to develop natural systems agriculture, which we know can grow yields that are comparable to conventional methods. We need to get more people on the land. We need to be thinking about an agricultural system that will be viable for thousands of years, not for 10 years, which is what's being advocated right now. So the challenges in agriculture are enormous, and having a way of keeping people focused on the land as a precious gift, I think, will be a good start. I could talk a lot longer about this, but I got to stop.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. A question for Christopher is about the philosopher Roger Scruton argued for eco-patriotism based on oikophilia, or love of home. Does that open up some middle way between binarized democratic choices of factory versus river that you mentioned is evident in the past?
Yes, I think it's great for a certain subset of our environmental problems. I don't, when I talk about applying democracy to this question of do we want a factory producing jobs or do we want a clean river? The choice, the public's choice, the democratic choice might be somewhere in between. It might be we can open this factory and you can pollute up to this much because this is what the river can tolerate, and that's a legitimate democratic choice. And I think that is the that idea that people can be trusted to not foul their own nests, if you'll pardon my saying so. I think it's a good way to deal with those local problems. What it doesn't deal with is these international climatic, air quality issues where most of the problem comes from externalities. And that's where you need to find some regulator who stands above the political units of today, but still has political legitimacy like those political units of today.
Can I follow up on this? I think this is a really important question in play here when we talk about the love of home. We have to ask, what home are we talking about? Because on the one hand, we can talk about home in fairly local, regional ways. But on the other hand, we need to think about the planet as a home in some sense, some extenuated sense. And the reason I bring this up is because lately I've been reading the work of glaciologists, and I've made brief reference to them in my talk. But glaciologists are very alarmed because freshwater snowpacks and glaciers in mountain ranges are receding at such an alarming rate that there is serious concern that within 20, maybe 30 years, tens, perhaps hundreds of millions of people are going to lose their source of fresh water. And the implications of that for home settlement of any kind are just enormous. And these are issues that need to be thought about not simply through a local lens, right? There clearly is a local lens that we have to bring to bear on this. But when we think about global temperature rise, which is clearly at play in glacial melt, how do we talk about our responsibilities for the homes of people who are far, far away from where I happen to live, for instance? Mm-hmm. I think that's a really important question. And I don't know that we have the sort of either the legal or the international political mechanisms to handle something like that.
But another question is, can you get people to feel the world is their home? Because it's not something that people have ever felt before. When we talk about the world, we tend to say it's a real cruel world, or like anywhere in the world, or it's not. It's a home is what you've bonded to, and you have shared yourself with and had parts of it shared with you. And most people don't feel that way about the planet. Certainly not the glaciers. They don't feel that immediate link to the glaciers.
But people in northern India, they do.
Right.
And so the question is, given that what we do here has effects for what happens for people in northern India, how do we talk about whether or not there needs to be some effort that is of an international scale or scope that's going to address a problem that is going to impact not just the people in northern India?
Yes, but I think I'm not sure that the sentiment of home is going to get you to that point.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
It's interesting, and I'd like you guys, if you would, please reflect on this for me, because at the same time, we've internationalized where all of our quote unquote commodities and goods, all come from. We still have this narrow view of my backyard. And I'm wondering, how do we get to the essence of, what is valuable enough to the individual that they could actually make the behavioral changes to live, more humbly. Again, I just, share a little bit. My wife and I have been trying to have a sustainable home For the last 9 years, we bought a place in a suburban, development, and we put in all of this investment in, over years, in getting topsoil brought in from compost of local waste and, leaves and things, and build gardens and build a, renewable energy system. And you're just trying to show how you can maybe make a difference, 40% here, 20% there, 30% there. It's a lot of work. But again, it's part of it comes from our mutual commitment that we're trying to reduce our impact on the bigger issues into some small degree, with a electric car being charged by the PV array, all that deal. But how do you get, and again, that happens to be because I'm able to be, with my technology background, to get it in an affordable way, because some of these things are still not quite affordable yet. But how do we get to what I could say maybe is the root? Because I do believe there's a lot of distrust of big government. There's a lot of distrust of internationalization. People say, my jobs went overseas, et cetera, et cetera. And yet at the same time, if we have exported on Earth Day, remembering we've exported a lot of our pollution. I've seen a lot of studies that indicate we have exported the lion's share of our manufacturing pollution by these global supply chains. So how do we take something that's abstract like that, and yet at the same time make us care for home, not only locally, but globally, in that we've now created, this system that we're all playing in, participating in, and causing damage, one would argue ecologically all around the world. And even if you don't, no matter what your issue is on climate change, there's no doubt that we're in the sixth extinction, right? And a lot of that comes from the ecological ruin of lots of other places that used to be more pristine around the world as well. So when you guys grapple with those issues, where do you think the real leverage points we have to the average person?
I'll start with one, and it's very difficult to say much that's intelligent and coherent quickly, but especially if you want to talk very broadly, which we can't do. So I want to zero it in a bit just around agriculture as one sector of our economy. And I think the point to be made, we've mentioned the worries about big government, and there's certainly real worries. I would also say we need to be very worried about big corporations. And the way we see this especially is in the world of agriculture, where we have seen the consolidation of seed, of meat, of processors, of fertilizers, of machines into the hands of a very small number of large corporate holders who then set the terms for what the production practices will be. And this has been not just damaging to land, plants, animals, it's been hugely destructive to agricultural communities and farmers. And so I'm a big proponent here of relocalizing, of redemocratizing, of building local entrepreneurship, about building community investment in agricultural systems so that stakeholders, whether they be producers or consumers, have a say in what we might call food democracy or even food sovereignty. Because when we have pricing determined by stockholders rather than stakeholders, we see so much damage that is being seen all through the lines of agriculture from seed to harvest. So I think there's a point to be made there, that can we do this without regulation? I think Christopher is right. We can't do it without regulation. The question is, who does the regulating? What's the scope of the regulating? And when do we make decisions about when a regulation has gone badly and so we need to change it?
That's right. You have to. It does concern the scope of the regulation and the culture of the regulation. We have been this country in the last few decades has got more and more regulated in so many ways. I mean, this is not one of those many campus discussions of campus speech codes, but let's take that as one example. But one area where regulation has remained kind of off limits is in business. And I think that we have to realize if you want locally grown food, it's going to be more expensive. And you're going to have to do things that are going to make it workable to grow food locally. And you're actually going to have to exclude you're going to have to exclude certain types of food from certain places. And if you're opting for heirloom tomatoes grown in your backyard, it's going to be more expensive than sort of like tomatoes grown with Monsanto seeds at some vast plant devoted to that purpose. But you need to commit yourself to that if that's what you're going to commit yourself to.
But I think too that we need to follow this up then to the next stage, which is to say, why is an heirloom tomato so much more expensive? And why is the farmer who's trying to grow tomatoes in a way that honors soil and seeks a just living wage, why has that become so difficult? And I think the answer, in large part, is the Farm Bill. But it's also in large part what citizens want, right? Citizens want food as cheaply as possible. And what that does is it creates enormous pressures on farmers to cut every corner imaginable, so that the profit margins now are so narrow that the only way a farmer can make it any longer is by having enormous yield and by having subsidy checks. So we need to talk about a food bill which is completely stacked against people who actually grow food, because under the USDA today, fruits and vegetables are specialty crops, whereas corn is not. And the corn is not being eaten by people. It's being made to make diapers. It's being made to feed cattle and pigs. It's being made to feed fish. I mean, it's being done for all kinds of things. And so there are clear incentive structures, regulatory regimes that are stacked against people who would want to otherwise have food that should be affordable and that should otherwise compensate farmers who are growing good, healthy food. Right? Just to give one small example, one of my friends who is a biodynamic farmer who grows the best food, no question, works 80 hours a week and had to stop because he couldn't make a living. There's something wrong with a food system when a farmer working with people cannot make a living doing the right thing.
Absolutely. I had a question from the audience says, how should regulation and innovation interact in improving our environment? So getting back to your point about regulation and linking in, how should regulation and innovation, how could they or should they interact in such a way to improve our environment? Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a kind of a taboo when we talk about about global warming and climate change, and that is population. We can get considerably more efficient, but if we double the number of people on the planet as we've done between 1980 and 2021, even a large improvement in efficiency is still going to result in more energy use. So as we grow that way, we're kind of prisoners of that population. We must innovate, as Norman was saying before. The choice now, which is to just sort of like to torque up the so-called green revolution, which is the sort of like water and nutrient intensive means developed by Norman Borlaug and others to grow more and more and more crops on a single unit of land, on a single acre, even though it's now reaching the point of diminishing returns. If that doesn't work, we're going to have to come up with other things like growing factories and artificial lamps or what. I don't know what it's going to involve, but we're going to need innovation as long as as long as we have population growth, we will need to innovate in some way.
Yeah, I mean, I think innovation is going to be crucial. And I think it's going to be important for us to stop the protections for some industries that prevent innovation, right? So that's going to be important to do. And I think this is where, again, young people have given me some source of inspiration and hope, because they're prepared to think outside the box. They're quite eager to imagine whether or not we can use waste to create energy. They're quite ready to think about plankton source bases of electricity production. They're looking at all kinds of things that are out of the box. But the trouble is that we've got industries that have major investment in keeping our infrastructure as it is, because the return on their investment won't be due for another 30 to 40 years. And this is where it's going to be very important to be able to stop that kind of blockage of innovation that might otherwise come along.
Before I thank you guys and close this out, I wanted to ask you if there's anything that you were hoping we were going to talk about tonight, that you were hoping you were going to get to say tonight to our audience, and especially to students as it relates to this topic, that I didn't get the chance from the audience or from myself to ask you. This is your chance to have sort of like a final word. So whoever wants to go first, it's fine. And then I'll wrap us up. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say one not really environmental related thing, which is I wish we could all be together tonight. And my heart goes out to you. It's an important time of your life, and it's a big undertaking for you and your family to go to college. And I'm sorry the epidemic has conspired to give you this virtual experience, but I hope it's going all right for you guys all the same. I hope you're managing to socialize, and I wish you the very best.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think I would say that for people going forward, the thing to get clear about in your mind is, what do you love? Right? Find what you love, whether it's some people or a community or a habitat or whatever. Find out what you love and then figure out how to make this love real, because hope grows when you put love to action.
Thank you. Thank you both so very much. It's been a pleasure for me to spend Earth Day evening with the two of you. You have taught me a lot, and it's been a wonderful
Likewise.
conversation and wonderful discussion. And I would just like to remind our viewers, just before we sign off, that if you would like to share this video webinar with any of your friends, it will be available at bucknellleaders.org. And again, we thank our sponsors, the Bucknell Program for American Leadership and Citizenship, and the Open Discourse Coalition for making this event possible tonight. And again, Professor Norman Wurzba, Mr. Christopher Caldwell, it's been a pleasure. And thank you, and have a great rest of your Earth Night.
Thank you, Peter, for hosting us and for putting this on. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Good night.
Good night.